The acrid smell of disinfectant stung my lungs, accompanying a searing, tearing pain in my lower abdomen. I snapped my eyes open to see a mottled white ceiling. Beside me, the air was filled with the pained moans of another woman in labor, and the rhythmic rising and falling cries of newborns. Instinctively, I reached for my stomach. It was flat now, leaving behind only a layer of loose skin and a dull, aching wound. "You're awake. It's a boy. 7 pounds, 2 ounces. He's a sturdy little guy," the floor nurse said as she wheeled in a small cart. Her voice was flat and clinical. In this ward where new life began every day, she had grown accustomed to the cycle of birth, death, and exhaustion. I turned my head stiffly toward the small wooden crib next to me. Inside was a tiny, reddish, wrinkled bundle. He was so small, his eyes squeezed shut, occasionally kicking his little legs. This wasn't a dream. I had truly returned to 30 years ago, back to the day I gave birth to my son, Julian. Memories of my past life rushed back like a tidal wave, finally settling on the image of my final moments. Lying in a drafty, earthen shack in my hometown, terminally ill from years of backbreaking labor, while my husband was away in the city celebrating the birthday of Sarah Miller's son. The door pushed open at that exact moment. Grant stepped in carrying an aluminum lunchbox. He looked sharp in his crisp military uniform, his features cold and stern. Even in a hospital room, he stood perfectly straight, like a sentinel tree. "You're awake," he said. His voice, like his expression, lacked any hint of emotion. He didn't sound like a man who had just become a father. He sounded like he was completing a routine inspection. "I got some millet porridge from the cafeteria. Eat it while it's hot." He placed the lunchbox on the nightstand without glancing at his son in the crib. Instead, he sat directly on the edge of my bed, his dark eyes fixed heavily on me. "Claire, I have something I need to discuss with you." I sneered inwardly. Discuss? In my past life, every time he used that tone, it was for the sake of Sarah Miller. "Go ahead," I said, my voice raspy as I struggled to control the trembling in my body, a tremor born of bone-deep hatred for this man. Grant remained silent for a moment, seemingly weighing his words, but what he said next perfectly matched my memories, word for word. Before Sarah's husband died in the line of duty, he called me to his side. He took my hand and made me promise I'd take care of his wife and son. Now Sarah is raising the child alone, and things are incredibly difficult for them. The department just issued 6 months' worth of bonus pay. I plan to wire it to her first. She's in desperate need of money. The kid needs to start school, and they need coal for the winter. He looked at me with an expression that suggested a sense of moral entitlement. "We still have my regular salary coming in. You and the baby won't starve. Claire, you've always been reasonable. You can understand why I have to do this, right?" In my previous life, that phrase, being reasonable, had been the shackles that bound me for a lifetime. I looked at him, the man I had once loved with my entire heart, and now he only made me feel physically ill with his hypocrisy. That bonus, combined with his various allowances, totaled $800. In an era where pork was only $1 a pound, that was a fortune, enough for a family of 3 to live comfortably for over half a year. Yet, without even a glance at his newborn son, he wanted to give it all to another woman. "And if I don't agree?" I asked him calmly. Grant clearly hadn't expected me to push back. He blinked, his brow furrowing slightly as his tone darkened. "Claire, have a conscience. Sarah's husband sacrificed himself for this country. We can't just stand by and watch his family suffer. This money is just a temporary fix. Once they're through this rough patch, I'll find a way to make it up to you." Make it up to me. I chewed on those words as the hatred in my heart nearly boiled over. He had said the same thing in my past life, yet until the day I died, his reparations were only ever given to Sarah Miller. "Grant, let's be clear. The boy lying here is your biological son. He needs nutrition, and I'm recovering from childbirth," I said, pointing toward Julian in the crib. "If you give her all that money, what are the 2 of us supposed to live on? Air?" "I told you my salary is enough to cover our household expenses," Grant replied, his patience wearing thin. "The porridge from the cafeteria is cheap, and we have flour at home. Sarah's situation is a matter of life and death. Can you please stop being so emotional right now?" Emotional. In his eyes, fighting for the survival of myself and my son was just being emotional. I took a deep breath. A sharp pain radiated from my abdomen, but it kept my mind absolutely clear. Right now, I didn't have the leverage to go head-to-head with him. He was a high-ranking officer, and I was a military dependent. my identification, my residency permits, and every resource I needed to survive were under his control. If I refused now, he would wire the money anyway and become guarded against me. I couldn't let him see that anything had changed. "I see," I said, lowering my eyes to put on an act of aggrieved compliance. My voice dropped to a whisper. "If you've already made up your mind, why bother asking me at all?" Grant's expression softened slightly as he stood up. Looking down at me from his towering height, Grant said, "I'm glad you can be understanding, Claire. I'm a soldier. I have to live up to the trust my brother-in-arms placed in me. I've already wired the money. Here's the receipt. Take a look. Consider it my way of giving you an account of things." He pulled a thin slip of paper from his pocket and placed it next to the lunchbox. It clearly stated the recipient as Sarah Miller and the amount as exactly $800. Looking at that receipt, the last shred of my illusions completely shattered. Even if he were truly doing this for the sake of a comrade's trust, he could have easily kept a portion for us or discussed it with me first. Instead, he wired the money and then came to notify me as an afterthought. He didn't care about me, nor did he have this child in his heart at all. I murmured, closing my eyes and refusing to look at him any longer. "Well, get some rest then," Grant said. "I need to head back to the base to handle some business. I'll come check on you tonight." With that, Grant turned and left the ward. His footsteps were firm and powerful, quickly fading away at the end of the hallway. I opened my eyes and stared deathly at that wire transfer receipt. These $800 were Grant's insult to us, but they were also my first spark of motivation. I propped myself up, enduring the pain to sit upright. The nurse was right. Julian was sturdy. Even in this era of scarcity, he looked healthy and strong. I looked at him and whispered, "Jules, Mommy's taking you away. We're not staying here. We're going somewhere where there's no Grant and no Sarah Miller." In this era, it was nearly impossible for a woman with no job and a newborn baby to leave her husband. A letter of introduction was the first hurdle. Without it, I couldn't even buy a train ticket, let alone settle down in another city. Grant returning to the base was my chance. He had taken leave these past few days for the birth, and now that the money was sent, work at the base must be piling up. He wouldn't be able to return for at least 2 days. I looked at the lunchbox on the bedside table. Inside was warm millet porridge, the only thing he had left me. I opened it and took large gulps. Even though the porridge was bland and I hated the taste, I had to eat. I needed strength. I needed to produce milk. I needed to survive for my child. After finishing the porridge, I began to organize my thoughts. In my past life, I lived in the military compound with the army. All my belongings were there, but I couldn't go back for them. Grant was well liked in the compound. If I went back to pack, it would definitely arouse suspicion. My only wealth was myself. I was a high school graduate, which counted as an intellectual in these times, and I was a skilled seamstress. More importantly, I knew the trends of the next 30 years. I knew that in the early 1980s, the South was undergoing a world-shaking reform. It was full of opportunities. As long as one had the courage, money could be made. And right now, what I lacked most was that courage and my first pot of gold. Since Grant had given all the money to Sarah, I no longer had to harbor any fantasies about him. As I looked at the receipt, a plan slowly formed in my mind. If I was going to leave, it had to be a clean break. I wouldn't just take the child. I would take everything that belonged to me, down to the last penny. I began to scan the ward. Aside from the woman in the next bed, there was no one else. The nurse checked the rooms about once every hour. My most urgent task was getting a letter of introduction. I couldn't get one without Grant, but I could get a hospital certification. I braced my body to get out of bed. Every step felt like walking on knives. I made it to the nurse's station, where the flat-faced nurse happened to be on duty. "Hello, nurse," I said, trying to make my voice sound weak but sincere. "I'd like to get a hospitalization certificate. My family needs it for something." The nurse glanced at me. "You just gave birth and you're out of bed already? Do you want to die? We issue the certificates when you're discharged." Something urgent came up at home," I said, lowering my head and acting as if I had a shameful secret. "I want to have the certificate ready so my husband can go handle some paperwork." In this era, outsiders usually didn't pry into the private business of military families. The nurse hesitated for a moment, but eventually pulled out a piece of paper and wrote me a simple hospitalization certificate. It listed my name, the reason for admission, and the details of the recent birth. While it wasn't a formal letter of introduction, it could prove my identity in a pinch, especially while traveling with an infant. Returning to the ward, I tucked the certificate away safely. Next was money. I had no cash on hand. Grant kept a tight grip on the finances. Although he handled my food and expenses, I never had more than $10 at a time. But I knew that back at the house in the compound, hidden under the cabinet in Grant's study, were his old military medals and some old photographs. And tucked inside that stack of photos were several dozen dollars he had saved up. It was his emergency fund. In my past life, I hadn't discovered it until I was organizing his belongings after his death. These $55 would be my startup capital. I looked at Julian in his crib. He was fast asleep. "Jules, we need to get better fast," I whispered, lighting touching his cheek. In this moment, the cowardice and confusion of my past life were gone, replaced only by the relief of a narrow escape and a desperate, do-or-die determination. "Grant, since you gave everything today to your first love, just you wait and see. I'm taking your son to a place where you'll never find us, to live a life you couldn't even imagine in your dreams. You can spend the rest of your life with your moral high ground, your so-called commitments, and your Sarah Miller." The postpartum pain felt like 1,000 needles stabbing me. Every step brought a fresh wave of cold sweat. I didn't dare linger at the hospital. Only 2 hours after Grant headed back to the base, I was already bracing myself against the walls, hobbling out of the ward. I went home first. The military compound was quiet. Most of the wives were either napping or busy with chores. Keeping my head down, I wrapped a scarf tightly around my face and slipped silently into the home Grant and I had shared for 2 years. Faded red double happiness wedding stickers were still peeled against the walls, and Grant's newly issued ceramic mug sat on the table. I headed straight for the study and locked the door behind me. Guided by memory, I pried up the bottom board of the bookshelf. My fingernails ached from the effort, but I finally managed to pull out a heavy iron box. Inside, alongside a few military medals, was indeed an old envelope. My hands shook as I opened it to find $55 and a few scattered ration coupons for grain and cloth. $55. Combined with a bit of private savings I had tucked away, I had a total of $68.40. In an era where the average monthly salary was $30 or $40, this was just enough to get me and the baby to the south. I didn't pack any bulky luggage, taking only 2 changes of clothes and a few pieces of soft, old cotton cloth I'd prepared for diapers. I tore some of the clothing into strips and bound that $68 tightly around my waist. It felt cold against my skin, but it gave me peace of mind. "Claire, are you in there?" A sudden knock at the door made my heart leap into my throat, and I nearly dropped my bundle. It was Mrs. Miller from next door. I quickly restored the bookshelf to its original state and wiped away a cold sweat. "I'm here, Mrs. Miller," I called out through the door. "I just came back to grab some baby blankets. I'm heading straight back to the hospital." "Oh my goodness, you just gave birth. Why are you running around? Where's Grant? That boy clearly doesn't know how to look after his wife." Mrs. Miller grumbled a few more words outside, and only when her footsteps faded did I let out a long breath. I shouldered my bundle and took one last look at this home. In my past life, I had wasted my youth here, only to be discarded like a withered weed in the wilderness. In this life, I would never come back. When I returned to the hospital, Julian was waving his tiny fists. Gritting my teeth against the pain, I wrapped him tightly to my chest, hiding him under my oversized coat. As I passed the nurse's station, I kept my head down and walked as fast as I could. "Hey, Julian's mom! You haven't processed your discharge yet," the nurse from before shouted from behind. "My husband is coming by later to handle the paperwork. I'm taking the baby for his vaccinations first." I threw back the lie without looking once and quickened my pace. The train station wasn't far from the hospital, but I moved slowly. The wind and snow lashed against my face like knives. Tucked in my arms, Julian seemed to feel the chill and moved restlessly. "Be a good boy, baby," I whispered. "Mommy's taking you to find a way to live." The waiting hall was packed with migrant workers carrying large snakeskin bags and families visiting relatives. The air was thick with the smell of cheap tobacco and sweat. I spent $2 on a standing room-only ticket to Guangzhou. "Comrade, there are no seats left. This trip takes 2 days and nights. Are you sure you can manage with a baby?" The ticket agent handed the ticket through the window, a flicker of pity in her eyes. I can manage, thank you. I took the stiff paper ticket, clutching it like an entry pass to freedom. The snow fell harder, and the train's whistle echoed across the open fields. A sound so heavy it made one's heart tremble. While standing in line for the ticket check, 2 young soldiers in uniform behind me were chatting in low voices. I heard Major Grant donated 6 months of his pay. Truly a stand-up guy. Yeah, I heard it was for an old comrade's family. They're going through a rough time. Listening to them, my heart remained as calm as a still pond. A stand-up guy. If standing up meant sacrificing his wife and child's survival for his own reputation, then I, Claire, couldn't afford that kind of heroism. The wheels began to clatter as the train lurched forward. The carriage was incredibly cramped, with people sitting even in the aisles. I curled up in a corner near the coupling between 2 cars. It was drafty here, but there were fewer people. I unbuttoned my coat and, using it as a shield, let Julian have his first feeding. The child nursed with great effort, and the sensation of my own flesh and blood drawing from me made the bridge of my nose sting with emotion. "Hey, sister, come sit over here. I've got some room." A kind-looking elderly woman shifted over, making half a seat's worth of space for me. "Thank you, ma'am." I didn't refuse. At a time like this, every ounce of strength was precious. The old woman looked at the baby in my arms and gasped. "Oh my, this little one hasn't even hit a month yet, has he? Why are you heading south in this freezing weather? Where's your man?" I lowered my eyes, my voice soft and calm. "My husband, he's gone. He passed away. The home couldn't hold the 2 of us anymore, so we're heading south to stay with some relatives." In that era, this kind of excuse was the most effective way to elicit sympathy. The elderly woman let out a heavy sigh, pulled a hard-boiled egg from her pocket, and handed it to me. "What a tragedy. Here, take this and eat. Don't let your milk run dry." I took the egg, and its cold shell gradually warmed in the palm of my hand. I didn't cry. Tears were something I had exhausted in my previous life. I watched the wilderness blurring past the window and calculated the time in my head. It was 4 p.m. If Grant went to the hospital tonight, he would discover I was gone. He'd check the house and the compound first. Once he realized the money in the bookshelf was missing, a man as sharp as him would surely guess I was trying to run. But he'd never imagine I was heading to Guangzhou. In his eyes, I was just Claire, a farm girl who'd never even left the county, a woman who only knew how to sew and mend. He'd assume I'd run back to my parents' village or was hiding at a relative's house to cry. Guangzhou, to his modern-day mind, was a desolate frontier not even worth a glance, yet it was the economic heart of the country for the decade to come. The train's speakers blared a grand, patriotic anthem, drowning out Julian's faint whimpering. I held him tightly, feeling the lightheadedness of my anemia, yet experiencing a clarity I'd never known before. "Grant, in this life, you can keep your medals, you can keep your first love, you can even keep your precious comradely duties. But this child and this life belong to me. I survived the grueling 2-day journey on that single egg and a thermos of hot water from the old woman. When I stepped onto the damp soil outside the Guangzhou railway station, the wind hitting my face still held a chill, but it lacked the biting edge of the north. I stood at the exit, watching the merchants surrounding me, people speaking in various dialects, their eyes burning with ambition and vitality. I leaned down and kissed Julian's forehead. "Jules, we're here." Meanwhile, thousands of miles away at the Northern Military District, Grant was likely just pushing open the door to my hospital room. Staring at an empty bed and a stinging hospitalization certificate, falling into a state of absurdity and confusion he had never experienced in his life. Back at the northern compound, when Grant pushed open the front door, he was carrying a bag of brown sugar he'd asked a fellow soldier to buy from the city. He had originally planned to go straight to the hospital, but halfway there, he remembered Claire's aggrieved, submissive expression in the ward, and his heart had softened inexplicably. He felt that since Claire was being so reasonable, he ought to give her some actual sweetness in return. However, he wasn't greeted by the usual warm, yellow glow of the lamp, but by a house filled with deathly silence. The air inside was freezing. The charcoal fire that should have been burning brightly had long since gone out, leaving only a basin of cold white ash. Grant frowned and walked into the bedroom. The bed, usually made with military precision, was a mess. He reached out. The blankets were as cold as ice. He strode to the study, and his eyes immediately landed on the displaced bookshelf. Grant's heart gave a violent thud. He bent down and pried up the floorboard. The iron box was still there, but the envelope inside was empty. Those $50-some were his emergency funds, kept there just in case, and now not a single cent remained. "Claire?" he called out tentatively. His voice sounded jarringly out of place in the empty house. He turned and ran out, nearly colliding with Mrs. Miller, who was carrying coal briquettes. "Oh, Major Grant, you're finally back!" Mrs. Miller looked at him in surprise. "Claire came back this afternoon saying she needed blankets. She looked ghost white. I thought she went straight back to the hospital. Has she not returned?" Grant didn't answer, his face darkening fearsomely. He hurried toward the hospital, his leather boots crunching loudly in the snow, fueled by a panic he had never felt before. In the hospital ward, Claire's bed was already occupied by someone else. "Julian's mother left a long time ago," the floor nurse said without looking up from her ledger. "She left this afternoon. Didn't even process the discharge paperwork. We're going to have to report this kind of fee-dodging to your unit." "Where could she have gone with the baby?" Grant's fists were clenched so tight his knuckles turned white. "How should I know? She got a hospitalization certificate and left in a huge rush. Looked like she was running for her life," the nurse muttered. "And Major, if I may say so, your wife just gave birth and you left her all alone? That's incredibly cold-hearted." Grant walked out of the hospital and stood on the wind-whipped, snowy street, the bag of brown sugar in his hand crushed out of shape. His first thought was that Claire had gone back to the countryside. That woman had always been timid. Where else could she go to cry except back to her mother's house? He took leave that very night and drove to Claire's hometown, a small mountain village about 60 miles from the base. At 3 a.m., Grant knocked on the door of his father-in-law's house. "Grant? What are you doing here in the middle of the night? How's Claire? Did she have the baby?" His mother-in-law, wrapped in a padded coat, looked at her son-in-law with genuine confusion. Grant scanned the room. Aside from his father-in-law, who had been startled awake, there was no one else there. "She didn't come back?" Grant's voice was incredibly raspy. "Come back. She just had a baby. Where would she go?" The father-in-law realized something was wrong, his voice rising. "Grant, where's my daughter? Where's the baby?" Grant didn't answer. He didn't even have the courage to face the questioning of his in-laws. If Claire hadn't returned to her parents' home, where could she possibly have gone in this freezing weather, carrying an infant who wasn't even a month old? By the time he returned to the military compound, the sky was just beginning to break gray. News traveled fast, and the compound was already buzzing with gossip. Sarah Miller knocked on Grant's door. She was still wearing that same faded floral padded coat, her eyes red-rimmed, clutching a small bag of dried noodles. "Grant, this is all my fault," Sarah started, the tears falling before she could finish her sentence. "Claire must be angry that you gave the money to me. I haven't touched it yet. Please, take it back and go find her. If something happens to her and the baby, I'll never have a clear conscience for the rest of my life." Grant looked at Sarah, and for the first time he found her delicate sobbing a bit grating. "This has nothing to do with you," he said, his voice cold and hard. "That money is for your son's tuition. Keep it." "But Claire, since she wanted to leave, let her leave. She doesn't know how to prioritize. To risk her life over a bit of money. With that kind of personality, she was bound to suffer sooner or later." Grant sat down and began to mechanically clean his service pistol, but his hands were trembling slightly. He convinced himself that Claire was just playing a game and throwing a tantrum. How many days could a woman who had never even been to a city last with only a few dozen in her pocket and a baby in tow? "In less than 3 days, she'll definitely write back begging me to come get her," he told himself. But one day passed, then 2, then a whole week. Every day, the first thing Grant did after work was check the mail at the guardhouse. No letters, no phone calls. No one had even seen her. It wasn't until half a month later that he received a package sent from the far reaches of the South. The package was light. Grant tore it open impatiently, but what fell out wasn't a plea for help. Instead, it was a bank book and a signed divorce agreement. The bank book had been opened at a branch in Guangzhou, and the balance was exactly 10 cents. On the agreement, Claire's handwriting was exceptionally resolute, even stamped with a bright red thumbprint. Next to the print was a line of small, clear characters. "Grant, your money goes back to your justice. My freedom goes back to me. Julian will take my last name. From this day forward, our paths will never cross again." Grant stood up so abruptly he knocked over the chair behind him. Guangzhou. That was the Southern Special Economic Zone, thousands of miles away and currently at the center of a social storm. He had always believed Claire was a moon that revolved around him, a light that would go out the moment he was gone. He had never imagined she would have the audacity to strike out alone into an unknown world immediately after leaving the maternity ward. "Major, someone named Sarah Miller is downstairs waiting for you. She says her child has a fever," the sentry reported outside the door. "Tell her to get lost." Grant roared, his eyes fixed on that 10-cent balance in the bank book. It was Claire's silent mockery of him. "All of your feelings and your charity are worth exactly 10 cents. In Guangzhou in the early 80s, the air carried a salty, humid, and anxious energy. As I walked out of the train station carrying the baby, my eyes were met with a sea of grayish-blue Mao suits, though bright-colored bell-bottoms were already starting to flash through the crowd. I didn't linger. I secured Julian tightly to my chest with a carrier and headed straight for Shihu Road. I knew that place was the prototype for the country's first illuminated night market, a pilgrimage site for countless hustlers and tailors. I had less than $40 left in my pocket. To survive in Guangzhou, this money would last half a month at most. I walked into a garment shop draped in fabrics. The owner was a dark-skinned man in his 50s, a cigarette dangling from his mouth as he tinkered with an old brother sewing machine. "Are you hiring?" I asked, my voice raspy from the long journey. The owner didn't even look up, answering in broken Mandarin, "Hiring? Do you have the skills? I don't take people with extra baggage." He jerked his chin toward Julian on my chest. I didn't waste words. I picked up a scrap of deep blue twill fabric from the floor and drew a pattern on the workbench with a practiced hand. No ruler, no chalk. I stepped onto the sewing machine, and the foot pedal began to move at a high frequency, creating a rhythmic clack, clack, clack. In less than 5 minutes, a perfectly tailored shirt collar with stitches so fine you couldn't see the seams was pushed in front of him. The owner's squinted eyes suddenly went wide. He picked up the collar, turning it over and over to inspect it. "I'm a master tailor from the north. I have a child to raise. I can do the work of 2 people. You just need to give me a place to stay," I said, looking at him. There was no pleading in my eyes, only the desperate grit of someone who had staked everything. The owner stared at me for a long time before stubbing out his cigarette. "My name is Chen. There's a tiny room in the back filled with fabric scraps. You can stay there. 2 cents per finished garment. You in?" "I'm in." And just like that, Julian and I took root in that fabric pile of less than 4 square meters. In the daytime, I was a woman possessed. The sewing machine under my hands almost never stopped. Julian was a very good baby. He seemed to know his mother was fighting for their lives. When he was thirsty, he nursed. When he was tired, he slept with the fabric scraps as his pillow. In the evenings, after Mr. Chen closed up shop, I would gather the remnants he discarded as trash. In that era, those scraps consisted of the finest wool, silk, and synthetic fibers. Drawing on the classic designs I remembered from my past life, I pieced those fragments together into stylish color-blocked vests and children's wear. A month later, I took my first trial batch to the night market. "This outfit is so sharp. Where did you buy it?" a young woman in a white Decron blouse asked, stopping me. "I made it myself." "It's one of a kind," I replied. I calmly quoted a price of $15. At the time, that was half a month's salary, but the girl didn't even blink as she handed over the cash. That night, the 10 patchwork outfits I brought were snapped up instantly. When I returned to my tiny room with a heavy stack of $150, Julian was clutching my finger in his sleep. I kissed him, feeling the bloody, jagged hole Grant had torn in my heart slowly being filled by the security of wealth. 6 months later, I left Mr. Chen's shop and rented a stall of less than 50 square feet in the Shisanhong district. I was no longer satisfied with just making finished garments. I discovered that the variety of fabrics in the South was far richer than in the North. Using my memories of the future, I accurately predicted the Hong Kong style that would trend that autumn. Bold red dresses. I bet all my savings, buying 3,000 meters of bright red silk at a low price from a factory. "Claire, you're crazy. That color is too loud. If it doesn't sell, you'll lose your shirt." Mr. Chen came over to warn me. I shook my head with a faint, effortless smile. "Mr. Chen, the world is changing. People have been suppressed for too long. Red is going to be the hottest seller. Just as I expected, within a month, women across Guangzhou went wild looking for bright red fabric. Long lines snaked in front of my stall. I didn't just sell cloth, I sold the cutting patterns too. $800, $3,000, $10,000. When I deposited a thick stack of bills at the bank, the teller looked at me with pure awe. But all I thought was, Grant, those $800 you gave Sarah Miller don't even qualify as spare change to me now. During this time, Grant sent me a registered letter. In it, he used a stiff, commanding tone, ordering me to return immediately. He said he could let bygones be bygones, that Sarah felt sorry for me, and even that he had pulled some strings to find me a job doing mending and repairs for the military's logistics department. After reading the letter, I casually tossed it into the coal stove used for cooking noodles at my stall. Mending. In his eyes, Claire was only fit to spend her life hovering around the hem of his trousers. I wrote back a single letter. Inside was nothing but a photocopy of a contract I had just signed for a massive garment processing factory. In the recipient line, I wrote, Major Grant's relative. In the sender line, I formally wrote, Claire, chairwoman of Shoe Trading Co. I didn't need him to let bygones be bygones. In that bone-chilling northern winter, at the moment he handed his salary to someone else, the Claire who only knew how to cry and mend had died. Now, I held the lifeblood of the era in my hands and my future in my arms. To me, Grant was nothing more than a patch of dirty snow on the road ahead. Once the sun rose, he would vanish without a trace. 3 years later, in a high-end tea house across from the Guangzhou Friendship Store, the air conditioner blew a cool, refreshing breeze. I had changed into a sharply tailored charcoal gray suit skirt, my long hair pinned up, wearing a rare imported gold watch on my wrist. Seated before me was a delegation that had come to negotiate a procurement project for the Special Zone's logistics uniforms. And there sat Grant, at the very end of the delegation table. He was darker and thinner now. The uniform he had once worn with such pride seemed to hang loosely on his frame. Because this procurement involved a massive sum, the military took it very seriously, sending several key officials. Chairwoman Xu, this is the list for the first phase of winter uniform procurement we've drafted. Please take a look, the lead official, Director Wang, said politely as he slid the documents toward me. I didn't take the papers. Instead, I picked up my teacup and took a sip, my gaze drifting carelessly over Grant. His expression shifted from shock and disbelief to a dead, hollow gray. He stared fixedly at my hands resting on my knees, which were trembling violently. He seemed to want to stand up, but a colleague beside him pressed him down. Chairwoman Xu, have we met somewhere before? Director Wang asked tentatively, sensing the tension. I don't recall, I said, setting down my teacup, my voice cold and detached. I see many people every day in Guangzhou. If you're trying to act familiar just to get a lower price, Director Wang, there's no need. Oh, of course not. Of course not. Director Wang laughed awkwardly, then turned to bark at Grant. Major Grant, what are you just standing there for? Pour some tea for Chairwoman Xu. She is the key person for this entire project. As if struck by lightning, Grant stood up stiffly. He walked to my side and lifted the teapot. As he poured, a few drops of warm water splashed onto the back of my hand. I'm sorry, he said, his voice low and raspy, carrying a faint pleading tremor. I pulled out a tissue and elegantly wiped away the water stains, my gaze never once landing on him. I spoke only to Director Wang. Director Wang, it seems the quality of your accompanying staff could use some improvement. If someone can't even hold a teapot steady during business hours, I find it difficult to trust the rigor of your contract execution. Grant's face went deathly pale in an instant. He stood there, unable to move forward or back, looking like a child who had made a terrible mistake, or more accurately, like a disgraced official who had just been slapped in public. After the meeting adjourned, he intercepted me in the underground parking garage. Claire? He rushed forward, trying to grab my shoulder, but my bodyguard stepped in and shoved him back. He stumbled to regain his footing, his eyes bloodshot. I've been going crazy looking for you these past 3 years. How could you be so heartless, taking the child and vanishing? Where's Julian? Where is he? Mr. Grant, please show some self-respect. I straightened my sleeve. Julian is my son. His last name is now Xu, and he is currently enrolled in the best private preschool in all of Guangzhou. As for you, if I remember correctly, weren't all your salary and bonuses given to people in need? How do you suddenly have the money to buy a train ticket to Guangzhou? Grant choked on his words for a moment before whispering, Sarah's child was sick. I did help them out, but I never intended to abandon you. I kept writing letters. I kept asking people to find out where you went. After you left, everyone in the compound pointed fingers at me. Major Grant, I interrupted, my voice tinged with a hint of disgust. Whether you are doing well or what the people in the compound think of you has nothing to do with me. The only reason I'm sitting here talking to you today is that you are a member of this delegation. Once the business is concluded, we are strangers. Claire, you've changed. He looked at me, his eyes full of shock. You used to be so kind. You would never speak to me like this. People have to grow up. I opened the car door and sat in the spacious back seat of the Mercedes. I was kind back then, because I thought my husband would shield me from the wind and rain. Later, I realized that he was the one bringing the storm. Grant, instead of standing here lamenting how I've changed, you should go back and check on Sarah Miller. I heard she's been busy scouting a new wife for you lately. After all, a man as heroic as you shouldn't be without a home. The car window rolled up slowly, shielding me from his face, which was etched with regret and agony. I leaned back against the leather seat, watching the figure in the rearview mirror grow smaller and smaller. In my past life, I died on a freezing winter night, begging him to buy a bottle of cough syrup for our child while he claimed Sarah's son needed a piano. I didn't cry then. And now, watching him stand behind the car like a beggar, I felt only an immense inner peace. This was just the beginning. I wanted him to watch me climb to the peak, to see how the woman he once looked down upon became a star he could never reach for the rest of his life. I wanted every memory of me to feel like a dull blade cutting into his heart, reminding him that he personally threw away the most precious treasure of his life. On the final day of the project negotiations, the signing ceremony was held at the Guangzhou Grand Hotel. Grant did not show up. I heard he had taken a sick day, but I knew he simply didn't have the face to be there. It wasn't until the ceremony ended and I walked out of the revolving doors that I saw him standing in the shadow of a stone pillar. To my surprise, Sarah Miller was standing beside him, looking travel-worn. Sarah had clearly just stepped off the train. Her face was sallow, and the floral padded coat that once made her look delicate now just looked tacky. She was clutching Grant's sleeve tightly, her eyes filled with terror and jealousy as she looked at me. Claire? Sarah spoke, still using that same fragile, walking on thin ice tone. Grant has suffered so much these past few years. He talks about finding you constantly. He can't even eat. Since you're doing so well now, for the sake of your time as husband and wife, please come back with us. A child can't grow up without a father. I stopped in my tracks. My assistant moved to intervene, but I raised a hand to stop them. Miss Miller. I pulled a pre-prepared notarized document from my bag and handed it to Grant. Since you're both here, this saves me the postage. This is the legal confirmation of the divorce agreement from 3 years ago, along with a household registration proof of Julian's name change to Julian Shu. Mr. Grant, you didn't sign it back then, but according to current laws and the evidence I submitted regarding your disappearance and the irretrievable breakdown of our marriage, our legal relationship has been terminated. Grant didn't take the paper. His eyes were fixed on the name Shu on the document. He let out a self-deprecating laugh. You changed his last name. You didn't even leave me a single thing to remember you by. Memories are for the living, I said calmly, looking him in the eye. As for my husband, he died in a hospital hallway 3 years ago. I turned my gaze to Sarah Miller. Miss Miller, you went through all the trouble of making this trip because you were afraid Grant would come back to me and cut off your source of income, weren't you? Rest assured, I, Claire Shu, have no interest in recycling a man like this. How can you talk like that? Sarah trembled with rage, turning to grab Grant. Grant, listen to her. All she cares about is money now. She doesn't have an ounce of a military wife's character left. Grant violently threw off Sarah's hand. The force was so great that Sarah stumbled back several steps and fell to the ground. Enough, Grant roared. He looked down at Sarah on the ground, his eyes no longer filled with the pity of the past, but with a look of realization that bordered on pure disgust. For 3 years, I gave you my money. I gave you my reputation, and in the end, it cost me my home, my wife, and my son. Do you really expect me to beg for a home that I destroyed with my own hands? He turned back to me, his eyes full of desperate, pleading sorrow. Claire? I'm not asking for your forgiveness. I just want to see Jules, just for a second. I'm his father. No, you aren't, I interrupted, my voice icy and resolute. Julian's father now is the opportunity of this era and my own backbone. He is going to attend the best schools and see the widest world. On his life's record, there will never be a place for a father who let his own biological son go hungry for the sake of his first love. Grant, this is the price you personally signed for the moment you chose your version of heroism. I stepped around them and sat directly into the waiting car. Before the window rolled up, I saw Grant collapse powerlessly onto the stone steps, burying his face in his hands as his shoulders shook violently. Beside him, Sarah was screaming and clawing at him, desperately trying to salvage her last meal ticket. 2 weeks later, I received a private call from Director Wang. He told me that after Grant returned to the base, he had voluntarily applied for a transfer to the harshest border defense unit. Before leaving, he forcibly sent Sarah and her son back to their original hometown and severed all financial ties with them. I heard Sarah wailed hysterically at the train station, but Grant never once looked back. I hung up the phone and looked at a drawing Julian had just finished on my desk. It showed a woman in a suit holding a little boy's hand, standing at the very top of a tall office building. In this life, I didn't wither away in a dirt shack. I didn't die in a state of regret. I pushed open the floor-to-ceiling windows of my office. Below me was the bustling, vibrant city of Guangzhou, teeming with life. The wind blew through my long hair, carrying with it the unique scent of freedom that defined this era. My era was just beginning.